Inside of today's video, we're going to be taking a look at over 34 balance changes which are going to rock the meta. There's going to be some broken hypercharges as well, which we're going to be ranking them in order. So make sure you're subscribed for all future sneak peek content, getting close to 300k. Without further ado, let's jump into it straight away. We're going to be taking a look at Brock. He's receiving a buff and his hypercharge damage per rocket is going from 500 damage to 750 damage. So this is a 50% buff. Again, I still don't think this is enough to make Brock's hypercharge useful, but at least it's a buff. Next up, we have two buffs for Grom, and the first one is going to be with his main attack damage. It's going from 2,120 to 2,280, so that's an 8% buff. With his star power as well, that's going to go to nearly 3k damage per shot, which is quite crazy. And then his supercharge rate is going from needing 6 basic hits to 5 hits, which is a 17% buff. This is going to be really big for Grom. He's still going to be easy to juke his attacks, but at least when you land them now, they're going to be quite impactful. I think that's going to skyrocket him back into the knockout and bounty meta, at least in comparison to other throwers. Next on the buff list, we have Tick, and he's receiving a buff to his hypercharge charge rate. So before the balance changes, he needed 4 supers to get his hypercharge. Now he just needs 2.5 supers to gain his hypercharge. So that's like nearly a 60% buff. That's definitely going to help him out in the meta. I don't even think Tick really needed a buff, but if they needed to buff anything, it was definitely his hypercharge rate, because I don't even think his hypercharge is that strong. So at least you're able to get it at least a couple of times in a game now. Sprite was next, and he's receiving an attack damage buff as well. His basic attack is going from 1,960 to 2,080, so this is a 6% attack buff, which I think Sprout is a little bit bad in the knockout and bounty meta. His hypercharge is the reason why he's struggling though, I think, but at least he'll be a bit more usable outside of those game modes. So next up we have Stu, and he's receiving 2 buffs. One of them is going to be a secret one. So the first one is with his HP. It's going from 5,800 to 6,400, so that's a 10% HP buff, which is massive. And his Gasser heal star power has actually been changed as well, because that's actually in line with his base HP. So that's going from 580 healing per super to 640 healing per super, so another 10% buff. I think it's going to catapult Stu easily back into the A tier. I think he was only just outside of meta because of Frank, etc. He's going to shine straight back into it. Next up we have Willow. She's receiving a small buff to her shield when she mind controls someone. So normally it's a 25% shield, now it's a 50% shield, so that's basically 100% buff. But I don't think that's really the problem with Willow, to be honest. It's more so that it's so hard to hit that super, but it's still a nice buff. At least you're able to throw out your super a lot more and not have to worry about dying so much. Next up we have a B. So her big shot damage is going from 4,000 damage to 4,400, which is a 10% buff. I believe this is reverting the change they made not so long ago when B was incredibly meta. So I think this is a great change because B just didn't have that sting in her anymore. So she's definitely going to be a lot better. Next up we have Spike. He's receiving 3 buffs and 2 of them are secret ones. So the first one is with his health. It's going from 4,800 to 5,200, which is an 8% buff overall. I think with Spike they've kind of tweaked around with his hypercharge, his damage, whilst I don't want to buff his damage too much because it makes him a bit too toxic. So they went with the HP route this time. Not too sure how it would pan out, but he's also received 2 buffs to his life plant gadget, because again that's in line with his HP. So not only has the health of the actual gadget gone from 2,400 to 2,600, the healing has also been buffed by 8% as well. So everything being buffed by 8%, that's basically 3 buffs to Spike. He's gonna be a bit better. Next up we have Gus, and he's receiving 2 buffs and one of them a secret change as well. So Gus's basic attack is going from 2,000 damage to 2,000, which is a 12% damage buff, which is actually really substantial. I'd say anything above like 7% you'll probably notice a lot in game, and that's a big one. And then of course his Cookie Popper gadget, it's in line with his main attack damage, so that's also received a 12% damage buff as well. I can really see at least Gus coming back to the knockout and bounty meta again. Next we have Mandy, and she's received a buff to her hard candy star power. The shield has gone from 30% to 40%, so 33% buff, but I just don't think it's going to do anything. The star power is terrible, and it's mainly due to the fact that the shots are just so slow without the other star power, and the super is slow as well. So why would you ever want to use the star power? I just think fundamentally it's terrible. Next up we have a buff for Ash, but it's quite meaningless because Rotten Banana has been buffed. It's gone from a 25% decrease in its health cost to 10%. So it's a 60% buff, but I just don't think it's really going to do anything. Ash needs a buff in a different category, whilst this gadget is just meh. Next up, we have Penny. She's receiving a health buff to her turret. It's going from 5,600 to 6,800, which is a 21% buff. I actually recommended this buff, and I just thought, you know, Penny's turret gets destroyed too easily. It's not even that good. So let's see where this puts her in the meta. I think she's going to be at least viable in like hot zone and maps where it's really hard to destroy this turret. I think she's going to get a lot of value out of it. Next up, we have Tyra, and she's receiving 2 buffs, and they're the exact buffs which I wanted to see with her. So her star powers have increased in base health. So the star power, the damage one, and the healing one have gone up. So the damage one has gone from 3,000 health to 3,400, which is a 13% buff, and the healing one has gone from 2,400 health to 3,000 health. So that's a 25% buff. I think this is a change that Tyra needs. She's got a hypercharge as well. The star powers will actually feel meaningful now. I think Tyra's going to skyrocket up to probably the A tier. And lastly, for the buffs, we have Lola. So she's received an attack damage buff from 520 per projectile to 560. So that's an 8% buff. You've got to realize as well, this actually gives her an increase in her super damage as well. I think this is great. Lola has been suffering in the meta for a while. An 8% buff is definitely going to feel noticeable, and she's going to feel a bit more of a tank counter now. Now let's move on to the nerfs, starting off with Clancy. He's receiving 3 nerfs. You'll be very glad to hear, because he's been so broken on ladder. So he's receiving the first nerf to his super charge rate from super. In numbers terms, it's gone from 100 to 65. So that's essentially 35% nerf. So basically now you can't just spam out your super and always have one up. So you should be able to approach him a little bit more, but he still does a lot of damage with that super. So next, we've got a super charge rate from basic attack nerf. So before, it only needed 5 hits to get his super from his basic attack. Now it takes 6. So a 20% nerf, which is quite huge. And then finally, his stage 3 super damage has been decreased from 1,800 per projectile to 1,520, so a 16% nerf. All in all, these are 3 big nerfs to his super. I still feel Clancy's going to be good on ladder, but I just think he's definitely overrated in ranked. Next up, we have Frank, and he's receiving 3 nerfs. He's only just became meta, and obviously he's been too troublesome for a while now. So his health has gone from 14,000 to 13,400, so that's a 4% nerf. His star power sponge has decreased in health boost from 1,400 to 1,340, so a 4% nerf. And his gadget, Irresistible Attraction, has his damage multiplier gone from 100% to 50%, so a 50% nerf. Those are 3 nerfs, which I don't think the health ones are going to do too much to him, but it's definitely a big one to Irresistible Attraction, because you could combine that with Power Grab and all other things and deal some insane damage. So Frank's definitely going to get toned down, but he's still going to remain at least in the A tier. Next on the nerf list, we have Meg. So we saw this one before. Her basic attack damage in her mecha form is going from 340 per projectile to 300. So this is a 12% damage nerf. This is quite substantial, and you're going to feel the difference here. I could see Meg dropping off quite a lot. Next up, we have Buster. He's receiving a health nerf. He's going from 10,400 to 10,000. So this is a 4% health nerf. I did recommend a small nerf to Buster just because he still is obnoxious on some maps, but I don't think it's going to steer him away from the meta. Just make him a little bit more manageable. Next up, we have Berry. So his healing trait has decreased in supercharge from healing from 75 in number terms to 50. So all you need to know, that's a 33% nerf. He's going to get super 33% less frequently. Let's just face it, Berry was broken in the sense like you could just spam supers galore. If you and your teammates grouped up and you just kept supering them, you would always have one available. It was just crazy. So this is definitely going to tone him down. Next, we have a nerf to Amber's Dancing Flame gadget. The damage is going from 2,100 to 1,890. So that's a 10% nerf. I think the gadget is kind of strong, but the main problem is the glitch where you can deal all the damage instantly if someone jumps onto you. So I'm hoping they fix that, but at least it's a nice nerf. And the final nerf is to Kit. The Cheeseburger gadget is receiving a healing nerf from 40% to 30%, which of course is a 25% nerf overall. I don't think that's the biggest problem with Kit though. I still think just the overall healing that Kit provides is just way too much and way too cheesy, but at least it's a nerf. So now we're going to be moving on to the 2 changes and reworks combined. So starting off with Daryl, he's receiving a rework. So now Daryl can store 2 supercharges in one, So what this means is as soon as he charges his first super, he's just going to have 2 available every single time. This is going to be beautiful. Daryl's going to go from the F tier to maybe the S tier, honestly, because these reworks seem to break a lot of brawlers. I'm happy because Daryl's been so unloved. He's going to be chaining supers. He's going to be able to make so many plays. This is a beautiful change. And lastly, for all the balance changes, we have Gil. So he's receiving 2 changes. One of them is going to be a buff. So his super damage has been increased from 1,220 to 1,640, which is a 34% buff, which is massive. And then they fixed his super because essentially there was like this bug with his hypercharge, and it's been around since the update, but they fixed it. So I think they realized that Gil wasn't the best, and then they buffed his super damage and he just became this really strong brawler. So they're actually implementing that a little bit now. So I think he'll still be in around the A tier. So now we're going to be ranking all the new hypercharges. At number 6, we're starting with Nanny. So Nanny's hypercharge is called Big Peep. So whenever you use your hypercharge super, the longer the duration of the super, the bigger the peep gets. So it's easier to hit, and I believe it goes faster, which is pretty good. I think the big disappointment with this Nanny hypercharge is the fact that it takes 19 hits to charge, which is 3 supers, then an additional 1 hit. So that's always a thing you've got to take into consideration. Also, the stat buffs are only 15% speed and 15% damage. I just think it's going to take too long for Nanny to get those hypercharges. You look at the best hypercharges in the game, and they're pretty quick to cycle and they're more impactful. And of course, I only think it's really going to make an impact in bounty and knockout. It's definitely going to make, it's definitely going to be worthwhile because you got like Piper's hypercharge and Belle's, for example. So she's going to be good again, but it's not going to be anything game breaking. So next is the 5th best new hypercharge. We have Tyra's hypercharge. So with this, it is a much larger super, and it lasts longer. I think that's what they said in Brawl Talk. But the reason why it's not as strong as others, because it still takes Tara's 2 supers to get, and that's 22 hits. We all know Tara takes a long time to cycle through to her supers, but if you can cycle that first one and get a really good pull, you're going to get your hypercharge pretty quickly. I think the main problem with it is not too extravagant. There's nothing really else to it. Other hypercharge supers are just more flashy, and like I said, Tara's just been suffering in the meta for a little while, so I'm not too sure this hypercharge really fixes her problems, but it's going to be good for team wipes. It's going to be good for turnaround potential. So I definitely see her like reinventing herself back into the gem grab and Brawl meta, but yeah, it's nothing game breaking in my opinion. So next, as the 4th best new hypercharge in the game, we have Serge's hypercharge. So with this, he will instantly go to the maximum level, well, level 5, and then he'll get an additional range, and it will also split. So this all sounds really good, but you got to realize that Serge only has 3 pieces of ammo. He has a slow reload speed as well, so it's going to be hard to always try and get the most value out of this, but it is pretty cool. And it also takes 10 hits to get, so 3 supers on 1 hit, so it charges pretty quickly. If you get to the final stage, you'll basically get a hypercharge, which is pretty cool. Again, I just think the big problem is I just don't think this is going to amount to like team wipes. I just think it's going to amount to maybe like 1 pretty clutch kill. So it'll be a good hypercharge, but it won't like completely break him. So next up, as the 3rd best new hypercharge coming to the game, we have Poco's hypercharge. So whenever he uses the hypercharge super, it will overheal people and give them a shield for the amount they overhealed for. So for example, if your teammate is at full HP, you'll get an additional 4,000 healing, 4,200 shield, which will be nice. And if say your teammate is like 1,000 HP below his maximum HP, he'll get that extra 1,000 healing from the super, and then the additional, I don't know, 3,200 shield, which is pretty nice. So the overhealing is going to be really good for Poco. The reason why I think it's going to be really good as well, because it only takes 10 hits to charge 2 Poco supers, which is going to allow Poco to make so many plays. Imagine, sometimes in Poco, you can cycle 2 supers within like 10 seconds. So I think this could actually potentially be one of the best ones. And we all know how Poco goes in the meta. If he becomes meta, it just goes to just chaos. So prepare for it. This hypercharge is going to be really underrated. The 2nd best hypercharge coming with the update, we have Squeak's hypercharge. So whenever he throws out his hypercharge super, it will actually spawn out another entire super. So he basically has 2 supers in 1. So this is going to be crazy, and another reason why this is going to be so good is because it takes 10 hits to get this super, which is 2.5 Squeak supers. I know it's sometimes hard to get it, but you can pretty much team wipe with this if you get the right combination going. And imagine this in Heist, for example, the amount of damage you can do. Imagine the amount of zoning you can do in Hot Zone. I think this is exactly what Squeak needed to go back up into the meta. I'm scared, because if his Hypercharge is as good as I think it is, it's just going to equate to so many team wipes. Yeah, it's definitely very powerful. So now moving into the best Hypercharge coming with the update, and you probably guessed it, or some of you might have said it's underwhelming, but I think it's his Hypercharge. So with his Hypercharge super, it's like a boomerang. So whenever you throw out the bats, it returns instantly back to you. So that means you deal double the damage, but not only that, double the healing. So if you got to think, if you can get multiple tanks or just multiple people lined up, the cycling you can do with his Hypercharge super is absolutely busted. And one of the best things about it, it only takes 10 hits, so 2 Mortis supers to cycle through to his Hypercharge. Again, that's going to be insane. People don't talk enough about how quickly Hypercharge cycle. I think in my mind, they want him to get his Hypercharge super quickly. You know, look in comparison. Tyra takes 22 hits to get her Hypercharge. Mortis 10 hits to get his Hypercharge. They clearly want this to be really good, and of course he's one of the most popular brawlers in the game as well. I think prepare yourself for a Mortis meta. People are going to underestimate this Hypercharge. I'm calling it right now, and I think it's going to be absolutely broken. So that's going to be it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.
What's your opinions on your egghead?